Hey everyone, this is Louis7 and I have a trait build guide video in the Lord of the Rings Online for y'all, this one being on the Red Line Rune Keeper. So I will be going over each trait choice in detail and include a gameplay section at the end to show my general rotation and how our traits play out. And there will be a lot of that with the Red Line Rune Keeper, but this one is also a bit special because I did this trait line in my old set of videos around Mordor or so, but this one will contain some updated thoughts, maybe better build, and just follow my new and improved format that you have seen in my recent class guides, and I think this will be helpful with that, and I am personally excited to see how that goes with this in mind. So I also want to mention this build isn't necessarily for in-game raiders doing the more difficult content, basically the same thing I say in every guide, but it is valid for everything, and the specific build is geared towards leveling, and solo play and definitely casual grouping in the DPS role, it works for that pretty well. And I decided to go ahead and do Red Line Rune Keeper because it is a very fun class and spec, and I think as far as my previous guides, this one is one of the ones that needed to be updated the most because it was one of the oldest, but moving on, we see a few themes with the Red Line Fire Rune Keeper. Using fire in-game, this is actually called Wrath of Flame, and then burning things with fire for dot-based DPS, and then burning things in AoE with fire, because we do have some AoE DPS, but more along the gameplay, we actually build and consume attunement is how our actual DPS plays out, but we will see how all these work together to create the mechanics for the Red Line Fire Rune Keeper and how our traits in the build affect that. So now we are in game and you can see a preview of what my build will look like when we finish it, and this is just what it looks like, what I have my points in. I have 68 trait points on my Rune Keeper, which is actually a bit more than some of my ults, so that will be helpful when we get to the very end of this, when we start going into the other line, which I have the yellow line. The blue line's actually pretty decent to dip into, but let's go ahead and respec and get back to the beginning of this. So you actually get quite a few things just for speccing into fire here in the red line. So the first thing we get is Smoldering Wrath, which is an attunement consumer that is a channeled skill that deals damage every 1 second, and for each attunement you have, it will do increased damage and increased duration. So at full attunement, the channel duration will actually be 5.5 seconds, and every second you're channeling it, it will consume 1 attunement, so that will consume 5 attunement once you channel it for the full duration if you have full attunement. Which I would recommend always using this at full attunement because it's your kind of big consumer, and channeling it for longer just means a lot more damage, and it does a ton of damage per tick. So that is something you want to use on cooldown at full attunement if possible. But moving on, we have Rid of Fire as well, which is one of our sustained DPS skills in our rotation. It's just a dot-based skill, and it has quite a few things going about it. It's a stacking fire damage over time, as it says. It actually has a short induction at 0.8 seconds, so that's kind of nice, but it can be applied up to 3 times, each one increasing the Ritz tier. And for every tier you have, you get 20% increased damage for the dot there. And again, this is one of our builders that's just used in rotation for our sustain part of our DPS. And then moving on, for our third thing, final thing we get here, just specking in the red line, we get Searing Words, which is every fire skill you use has a 20% chance to apply a pretty strong dot. It also does a little bit of initial damage. But as far as my numbers go, they're pretty high because I'm level 120, even though I'm not that great geared. But Searing Words is a very strong dot, especially at low levels. Once you spec into red line, that will be a very strong dot. And if you actually have that applied, you have a 1/5 chance whenever you use a skill. But if you do have that applied, it will help you kill enemies a lot faster while leveling. So let's go ahead and spec into Redline here. And now we can look at the traits in the first row here, and in the first trait we just have increased raw tactical damage, and that would increase our damage output, so that does seem appealing. Let's see if there's anything more worth putting in at this point. We could get something that increases the damage of Fiery Ridicule, and one criticism of this is it only affects 1 skill, so it's not that appealing, especially since Fiery Ridicule isn't going to be your strongest skill at this point. Even though you don't have many at low levels, it's actually one you do use more, but as you level up, especially get towards the middle levels, I'd say around 30 to 40, and especially after 40, you won't be using Fire Ridicule quite as much, and having just raw tactical damage would definitely increase your damage output a lot more overall. And even at low levels, you know, getting something that affects all your skills versus 1 skill is definitely more useful. So that's a comparison between those two. And I went ahead and did that because I know this third one here is more of a utility skill. A utility trait rather, and this one is self-motivation. So to look at self-motivation, that has a short induction and restores maximum power while giving you some neutral attunement. And this just adds a heal and power cost reduction buff to self-motivation. The power cost reduction buff isn't too significant, and the heal is kind of a little bit, but it is nice to have. So as far as this trait goes, I would definitely recommend putting a point in it whenever you feel like you might need some sort of self-healing in combat that you can't do with your other heals that you just naturally get. At low levels you'll have Prelude to Hope, but quickly you'll get Epic for the Ages and Whirl of Exhaustion for some quick healing for yourself. But if you ever do feel like you need some more survivability and to self-heal, like self-motivation with a short induction like that, it's definitely worth putting a point in. But as far as my build, I haven't had issues like that on my Rune Keeper, so I would definitely keep filling in just DPS things. So in this first row, let's go ahead and get just the raw increased tactical damage here. Moving on, we get our first set bonus, which just gives plus 20% Wrath of Flame damage, and that'll again affect all your fire skills, just the name they give fire skills in this game. And that's just a passive damage boost, will definitely help you as leveling up. You should actually notice it because 20% is a decent amount. But in this row, we get two traits, and the first one here is a stacking damage buff. So every time you use a fire skill, you get a fire damage buff that lasts 10 seconds, and that will stack up to 5 times. So if you use 5 fire skills, you'll get the full benefit of that stacking 5 times and get 5 times the buff. So at rank 5, for example, if you have that at rank 5 and you use 5 fire skills, you have a 25% fire type damage buff. And it does take a little bit to build up and kind of plays to the dot more sustained damage theme of the Redline Fire Rune Keeper here. But it's still something while leveling, even using one fire skill, just getting the plus 5% raw damage from using one skill will be helpful. But also in this row we have Essence of Flame, which is a strong rotational skill that we will get. It has, at first it's actually not too appealing. It does a lot of upfront damage and doesn't really play into the AoE or the dot theme of Redline Rune Keepers. One thing it does is refresh the current tier of Fiery Ridicule on a target. So if you are unfamiliar, Fiery Ridicule also stacks up to 3 times, kind of like Rid of Fire, and does fire damage dot as far as that goes. So this will refresh the duration of that. So if you have like Fiery Ridicule at tier 3, this would be really nice and refreshing that, especially since the dot on Fiery Ridicule does not last that long at 10 seconds, and this does play a little bit to the sustain. But as far as the usefulness of the skill, we kind of can see it linked to other traits in this, in our red line here, and this one will just increase the damage of it, but Linnet of Flame here will actually make it an AoE and affect more targets. So this will be a useful skill. Again, it does have, at this point, a longer induction, but compared to your other skills, it will actually help your output on a single target. It just takes a little bit long to induct, but it's still worth it because of the pretty large amount of upfront damage it does actually. So I would go ahead and fill the 4 points in here. We have the same issue, is why I put the 4 points on Tail of Rage here, because Fire Ridicule only affects one skill. And even if at max rank it makes the Fire Ridicule effect up to 3 targets, there shouldn't be too much situation where you really need AoE, especially while leveling, and even in group content I never noticed the need for AoE versus just getting something to help what I have right now, and kind of taking the drawback of not getting increased damage to get just increased damage on Fire Ridicule and the potential for the AoE at 5 points. But if you do notice you need that AoE Fire Ridicule to affect 3 targets for some reason, or just really want that effect because it's neat, you could definitely put points in it. Moving on to the next set bonus before we get to those traits, we have Rid of Fire now tiers down instead of dispelling upon expiration. So Rid of Fire would normally just like expel once you get the 20 seconds from tier 3, but now it'll tier down, which will make it last a lot longer, up to a minute actually, if you have all 3 tiers on an enemy and just let them keep burning with it and not reapply Rid of Fire at all. So that is something nice to help very long sustain where you're not keeping up with your Rid of Fire as well. Or you just go in a long period without casting Rid of Fire, which can be possible in some longer fights, but usually doesn't happen, and this is kind of more niche use, but just know that you do have this. When you're fighting multiple mobs, it also has a little bit of effect for increased sustained damage in AoE. But yeah, that is a good thing to know we get, and will be kind of convenient to have, I suppose, a nice quality of life type thing, without really significantly boosting our damage. But as far as the traits go in this row, we have Volcanic Runestone, which is... So this is the Fire Runestone basically, and this does damage to nearby enemies. It pulses every 1 second or so, and the Runestone lasts for 11 seconds. It has a 30-second cooldown, builds 3 battle attunement. And this is really strong at low levels. It doesn't actually scale that well to high levels, but my Rune Keepers, both the level 50 something one and 40 something one, it still does significant damage and is worth taking a point even for that level. But especially at low level, it's just really strong and worth putting the point in. So we will go ahead and do that. And at this point, you kind of have to decide if you want Tail of Rage. I already mentioned what these two do, but to recap before I go into what to choose, we have the increased damage of Essence of Flame. And Essence of Flame is a strong skill at this point. It's just kind of, it takes long to induct and only affects a single target, but putting the 3 points in this, which you have to put all 3 in, to unlock Linnet of Flame, which would give it more targets and make it an AoE, is very beneficial and just makes that AoE and our AoE Fire Rune Keeper DPS a lot stronger. So that is something we want to look out for, but you kind of have to decide if it's more worth putting in Tail of Rage, and I do not think it's worth putting in Tail of Rage, so I would go ahead and put 3 points in Explosive Rhetoric and put 1 point in Linnet of Flame, so you get Essence of Flame here to be an AoE and just make it stronger, because it is already one of your strong skills and something at this point you want to open up with because it does so much immediate damage. It's better than your dots as far as that goes, and just to foreshadow later on kind of why we want to build it up like this, and you know, maybe later on, since we're so dot focused, it doesn't seem that appealing. We actually get Essay of Fire will be our next set bonus after this one, and that will deal a lot of damage, but the thing Essay of Fire does is it makes your next skill have no induction, so you often combine that with Essence of Flame once you get Essay of Fire, and will just help Essence of Flame seem a lot more useful outside of AoE. And just while leveling in general, getting the no induction on that pretty long induction skill will be helpful. So I just wanted to foreshadow some of the reasons why it's such an important skill to go ahead and build up, other than it simply being a strong skill at this point, not really playing to our dot theme, and having much use out of just the single cast it and let it be. So to get to this set bonus we just unlocked, this one reduces the cooldown of Smoldering Wrath against Smoldering Wrath, our very strong consumer. You want to use that max battle attunement on cooldown, so reducing the cooldown. Use it more often, definitely helpful. And then it's also immune to interrupt, so while leveling at low level, having that interrupted is really annoying and frustrating, so having that being immune to interrupt will increase your output against mobs where they might be interrupting you with that. And it just will be overall helpful to have that a nice quality of life thing again for Smoldering Wrath to improve it, especially when you're taking any sort of damage and you're mainly playing solo. Even though Smoldering Wrath actually does a ton of damage, that you can usually cast it on a mob and they'll just die without doing any other hits on them. So yeah, that's a nice thing to get and important to know we have on top of the reduced cooldown, so you can just use it more frequently. So in this row we have Molten Rock, which would increase the damage of Volcanic Runestone, but importantly at max rank it makes the Volcanic Runestone ground targeted. And I'm going to be honest, I do not like the ground targeted effect of Volcanic Runestone compared to just it placing it at your feet. It kind of makes it a little bit clunky to use, and I often want it placed at my feet anyway because that's where mobs are usually attacking me. And the Volcanic Runestone is nice because it can tank mobs, and if it tank mobs and takes their aggro at melee range, that's kind of what you want to use it for in a way, besides just doing a lot of damage. So getting the third point in that actually is very unappealing, and on top of that, just getting the raw increased damage from that, while it is a strong skill, especially AoE at this point, it's not really worth putting a point in that where you could get something like Tail of Rage that affects everything. Or as we'll look later, we also need to finish out Linnet of Flame, but as we'll see later, some of the things in this row are very appealing. So the first or second thing in this row, we have just increased physical mitigation. That'll boost our defenses some, but it's kind of the same story as overflowing confidence. It's not really something we should need, but if you do find yourself really needing defense, I would first put the point in overflowing confidence, but then you could move to thick-skinned after that, but I don't really think those are worth putting points in. And actually, on that note, I forgot Haste and Determination is actually in this row. So this is another utility kind of survival type trait. And this one reduces the cooldown of self-motivation, but importantly at max rank it makes self-motivation have no induction and can be used while moving. So it makes it a very nice mobile skill that if you put your points in overflowing confidence to get that heal, it would be really nice. So the way I would actually recommend, if you're finding you need some survivability boost and some maybe self-healing boost, is I would first put a point in overflowing confidence and then put 3 points in haste and determination, and then go for thick-skinned after that, kind of the priority of your self-healing survivability boosting traits. But again, as far as my Rune Keeper experience, none of that has really been needed, and I am fine like just continuing getting more DPS oriented traits. So the last trait in this row is fire skills reduce the armor of a target, so this seems really appealing. You get, actually I should cover what it does first, but at rank 3 you get up to minus 15% if we actually put points in it. We see that goes to minus 15%, and it's an 8-second debuff, but on every fire skill it applies, so it's basically a permanent debuff on your enemies. So one thing about this is it reduces armor rating, and armor does not affect enemies' tactical mitigation, which is what you're doing. You're using tactical skills, so it draws from their tactical mitigation. And armor doesn't affect that as much as, say, physical mitigation, but it is still something nice to have, and if you're doing any sort of group content, it will be very beneficial to your allies by debuffing and effectively increasing the damage enemies take just by reducing their armor, but it still does affect your skill some, and is something we can look towards putting points in. But at this point, I think going ahead and getting the last point of Tail of Rage just to get the increased damage from that to 5% more damage even, so now we can get the max buff of 25% from that, will be more useful. And then I would put points in Essence of Flame max targets, but if you find yourself never really in an AoE situation where you need more max targets from that, you don't have to put a point in here and could prioritize something else. And this is when I would go ahead and put in points into Molten Flame. I do want to note, if you never do group content, like it's just something you never ever do, and a lot of the content you're going through is like pretty simple and you're not doing tougher fights that much or very long fights solo, I would put points in Conflagration of Runes instead and go ahead and get 3 points in that, because getting fiery ridicule damage would be more useful than reducing armor on the enemy for the rest of your skills. But at this point you have spent 20 points, and that will unlock the next set bonus, and this is a very important moment for your Fire Rune Keeper, because as I kind of foreshadowed earlier, Essay of Fire is a very strong skill and really increases your initial burst damage to start a fight. So what Essay of Fire does is it does a lot of initial damage, a lot of dot damage, and it also makes your next fire skill have no induction. So Essay of Fire itself has a sort of long induction and builds battle attunement, and has a relatively short cooldown at 10 seconds. So it's something you can use fairly frequently, and fights can start most fights with it. It'll be off cooldown quite frequently, although you do honestly kill stuff pretty fast. You can probably go through a few mobs before you can use Essay of Fire again. I have just kind of remembered that experience on my Rune Keeper, but yeah, this is a very strong thing to open fights with and use on cooldown and rotation when you're building attunement and basically not consuming it with Smoldering Wrath. And the way this works is you want to use your longest induction skills after it, just so it has no induction. So the strongest skill for that is Essence of Flame. And I would always use, always to open a fight, Essay of Fire and Essence of Flame. That's kind of your best thing to start a fight with. And then I do want to point out now, we'll get into this with the gameplay section, but if you use Essay of Fire and Essence of Flame, that will build 6 attunement, and you only need 3 attunement left to use Smoldering Wrath. And the Runestone is something you can really quickly place down at your feet to build the last 3 attunement, to be at max attunement, to consume attunement with Smoldering Wrath and use your finisher with that. That can be a very powerful opener and just a really quick way to get your damage building up with Smoldering Wrath. So yeah, that's just really nice to get, and kind of why I key on it, because it's a really core part of the Fire Rune Keeper experience and will significantly boost your funness, I think, and just damage output while leveling. It will make the starts of fights and just fights in general go a lot quicker. So moving on to the actual traits in this row, we have Mystifying Flames and Scathing Mockery. So I actually want to cover Scathing Mockery first, because it is something I see a lot of Rune Keepers use this skill way more often than they should. So if we put a point in Scathing Mockery and actually kind of used it, it is a very niche use skill. So it has max targets of 5, but it has a really long 3-second induction, and it does very small damage. The dot from it is weak, the upfront damage from it is weak, and it's just a weak skill, but the use is really long fights with a lot of mobs. So if you have a fight that's going to go the full 30-second duration, and you can affect, it would actually be over 3 targets, so it would be useful. It's not even that worthy for a 3-target or fewer fight. So if you have 4 or more targets, basically, it can be worth using if you're fighting them for the full 30 seconds when you can get that full debuff and dot on them. But otherwise, it's basically not good. You have better options for other fights. And yeah, it's just not really great. I do want to mention at this level though, because you don't quite have Fire Ridicule to be an AoE and affect 3 targets, that's kind of, it would make up for that a little bit at this point to put a point in it just to get the AoE effect, because you don't have Fire Ridicule to be an AoE yet. But at 3 or fewer targets, it's always better to use Fire Ridicule, unless the fight is going for the full 30 seconds again to have both of those effects up. And it just has to be a really long fight for that, and usually you won't run into situations with that. And kind of the reason I keep going on about this is I see, as I mentioned, so many Rune Keepers opening a fight with, say, Essay of Fire and then Scathing Mockery on fights. They should not really be doing that. And one thing I do have to comment there, and that seems like theoretically good, because Essay of Fire removes the induction of a 3-second induction skill, which really helps with that, and Scathing Mockery is like a big AoE and has a long duration dot effect to it, so it seems like a good thing. It's just Scathing Mockery itself is so weak that it's not really worth using that much, and that is why I don't think it is actually worth putting a trait point in. This is one of the very few active skills, like an active rotational skill even it would be theoretically if it was stronger, that I would actually not put points in. It's one of the few ones I wanted just to get my thoughts on that. Maybe went on that a little bit too long, but it is something I see a lot of Fire Rune Keepers do that should be avoided. But again, if you find yourself in those longer AoE fights, you could definitely use it, and it's not a bad thing to use it. Actually, is a good thing. It's just kind of at this place, and all my Rune Keepers I leveled, including this one and my 2 lower level ones I have right now, that are like 40 something and 50 something, I have never actually wanted to use Scathing Mockery on either of them, and that's why I am not going to put a point in it at this point, and we might revisit it later actually, because it does have that niche use still. It still has that use. It's just something at this point we would rather put points in something else, I think. And to get over the next trait in this row, finally we have Mystifying Flames, which is your fire skills have a 30% chance to reduce fire mitigation. So this is basically a more appealing Molten Flame because it reduces their mitigation, the type of damage you're doing, fire. But the problem with this one is it's every fire skill has a 30% chance to, and if we keep applying points, we see the 30% chance stays the same. It's just the magnitude of the mitigation reduction increases. So that still is something nice, and if you're in a long fight, you have 30% chance to apply a 20-second duration buff, so eventually, once you apply it the first time, basically it's a permanent debuff on the enemy. It's just to initially apply it, you have a 30% chance to do that, but any sort of longer fight, you should be able to keep that applied if you keep using your fire skills on the enemies and decrease their fire mitigation. I do want to note, because this is a debuff, it affects other character skills, so you have something like a Hunter even, which might have fire arrows, and they're another high DPS class. They can kind of work with the Rune Keeper, and this debuff will significantly increase the Hunter's DPS, oddly enough. So it's a nice thing for situations like that where you're running with a lot of other fire classes and group content, maybe just helping boost their damage some. Some other classes this might affect include the Lore Master. That's the only one I'm thinking off the top of my head that does fire damage. But yeah, that's definitely a nice thing, and it's a nice thing for ourselves as well, not just the benefit our group can get. So I do think that is worth putting 3 points in, even if we consider the other things, which is mainly Fire Ridicule at this point, that one, that we would put points in. And we actually do need 2 more points to finish out this row and set bonus, which would be, I would go ahead and put the 2 points here in the Fire Ridicule one in our first row, just because we don't have other options, unless again you need a survivability boost. That is always an option, and this is actually a good time to spend 2 points on it, because these are kind of just filler points if you do happen to want that survivability boost. Again, 1 in Overflowing Confidence, and then go Haste and Determination, and then the mitigation. Okay, moving on to the next set bonus in row, we have Master of Connotation here, which is stacking buff on the Rune Keeper. And at 5 stacks, this buff will make the next writ heal morale and have no induction, which would be Writ of Fire for us as a Fire Rune Keeper here. And I do want to note the actual buff Master of Connotation does nothing until it gets to 5 stacks, so it's kind of just a once it gets to 5 stacks. And once you use 5 fire skills, your next writ will not only heal morale, but have no induction. I do want to point out that it still can't be used while moving, so you still have to like stand still. I couldn't move like this and use it. I'd have to actually stand still and cast Writ of Fire, but it would be no induction, and that is a nice thing, and just kind of something, a nice quality of life thing. It will boost our damage a little bit, but the heal is also nice, especially solo, to be able to get a quick heal from it after using 5 fire skills. So in this row we have Afterburn, which is our first trait here, and this just increases fire damage over time, and we have a lot of damage over time, even things like Smoldering Wrath, which do a ton of damage, that would help with that, and I actually do want to confirm. Let's go ahead and apply this. I just want to make sure that this actually does work as I think it does, and that's 16,500, so we're doing some experiments during this. Okay, so I reverted our traits back because that experiment failed, and this damage over time does not actually affect Smoldering Wrath there, as I thought it might have, because it's kind of a damage over time skill, and I thought that damage over time would affect that. But just to note, this doesn't affect Smoldering Wrath, but it still is very strong because you still have a lot of dot damage like Searing Words, Essay of Fire, Fire Ridicule, and Rid of Fire, just a few I think. That might actually be all of them, but that's still a lot of damage over time skills, so this definitely would help our damage overall, and is something we want, and is the most appealing thing we have so far. But we have Empowering Flame here, which is Mystifying Flame procs briefly reduce inductions by 10%, up to 30% for rank 3 in the buff lasts for 8 seconds just like. And then Mystifying Flames here, that is the one that has a 30% chance to apply, so it will have a 30% proc chance for Empowering Flame as well, and that's the one that reduces the mitigations, and we put points in that. But anyway, having this is every fire skill you have a 30% chance to reduce your inductions by 30%, which is quite significant once you put points in it. And even though you only have a 30% chance to apply that, the buff itself lasts 8 seconds, so ideally you should be able to keep applying it and mainly keep it up. You might have some little downtimes if you do put your points here in Empowering Flame, which I would recommend, but you would have maybe some downtimes occasionally if you're not quite using enough fire skills, or if you're inducting, like Smoldering Wrath just takes a long time to induct, and actually not induct but channel. And that just might make it where you have some gaps of this buff, but overall you'll be using enough fire skills for it to be a pretty significant buff and reduce your inductions by quite a bit. So compared to the fire damage over time, I think this is overall more useful and will have more output per your character, and I think make them more fun to play just because you're casting stuff quicker, not casting stuff fire. But to get over that, we will go ahead and move on to the damage over time here and put 2 points in here, which unlocks the next row, the last row actually, in the next set bonus. And this set bonus is called Extreme Heat, and that one is Searing Words. The damage is increased by 10% for each current tier of Rid of Fire on the target, so Rid of Fire tiers up to 3 times, so that'd be 30% increased damage, and this is just a passive damage boost to our damage over time mainly actually, and kind of our sustained damage, so it would take a while to get Rid of Fire to tier 3, and then getting the extra benefit from Searing Words doing even more damage, just kind of a longer, really plays to the sustained part of Fire Rune Keeper DPS and longer fights. But do know that this will increase the damage of Searing Words, which again, to remind you, it has this at the bottom here that on every fire skill there's a 20% chance to apply Searing Words, which is the debuff you see there, and it's not anything new to us. Searing Words is a thing we actually get just for speccing in the red line, but yeah, having the increased damage just increased sustained DPS basically is how that works. So if you are in longer fights, you might notice a little bit increased damage from that. But moving on, the first thing we have here is Combustion. And this is finally our second Fire Rune Keeper consumer. We do have a Lightning consumer, Shocking Words, that does stun and instant lightning damage, but we finally get a second Fire consumer here, which consumes all of our attunement to deal damage to all enemies around your target, on top of just dealing some immediate damage to your target. Another thing it does later, so later it'll also spread the Rid of Fire to enemies for even more like sustained AoE damage, but at this point it's just a big AoE that consumes attunement. So any sort of AoE situation, this would be worth using over Smoldering Wrath. If you have a lot of targets around you, for fewer fights with like maybe 3 or fewer mobs about that, it can often be worth actually using Smoldering Wrath still until you get your set bonus there, which would make this much more appealing in AoE, but Smoldering Wrath is just so strong is kind of why even in some smaller AoE fights is more worth using. But Combustion itself is pretty strong, and it has a 15-second cooldown, so you can't use it quite as frequently as Smoldering Wrath, but sometimes while Smoldering Wrath is on cooldown and you have maximum attunement, which again you'd want to use this at max attunement because it does more damage per attunement, You might be able to weave in some combustions even in your single target rotation. So that is something we do want, but to go ahead and look at the next one here, we just have increased pulses for all fire damage over time effects. So something else that affects really long fights and our sustained damage to have. Our dots last longer, and this affects everything, like searing words instead of 6 seconds will be 10 seconds. Same thing with Essay of Fire, that will be 10 seconds now, so just a lot more dot damage later on in fights doesn't really affect our immediate damage up, and while questing and leveling, you honestly might not notice that at all. But I would go ahead and put a point in Combustion, and then put a point in Branded Marks here. So now at this point, because we kind of finished our last row here, we have to look back at some traits before in this line to see which are most useful, and we need to spend 3 more points to unlock the next set bonus, and I think this would actually perfectly fit Afterburn here just to increase our damage over time, because again, that affects all our damage over time's effects and not Fiery Ridicule, but again, if you feel like you need some AoE, it's a perfect 3 points to finish that out as well, so that works nicely if you do want that instead. But for overall output, I would recommend Afterburn. And then we unlock the last set bonus here, and as I kind of portrayed earlier, we get Seething Truth, which makes Combustion spread the current tier of Rate of Fire to all enemies hit. And the nice thing about Combustion is it doesn't have max targets, so any target, because it's kind of a ground effect, any enemy around your target rather would get hit by this, and if you have Rate of Fire on your target, especially tier 3, spreading that would be a lot of sustained AoE damage and just get a little bit of a dot in AoE and makes this a lot more appealing to use Combustion when you have Rate of Fire on the enemy to spread it. And that makes it a lot more useful if you have tier 3 Rate of Fire on an enemy to go ahead and use Combustion in a smaller AoE situation as well, to go ahead and quickly spread that and just do more AoE damage. And then on top of that, this will also increase Smoldering Wrath damage by 30%. And Smoldering Wrath is strong, increasing the damage by 30%, that'll just make you stronger. On top of that, Essay of Fire, the last effect from this is Essay of Fire's initial damage increased by 30%. The Essay of Fire initial damage isn't the main component of it, but it is does impact our initial burst damage if we use Essay of Fire. Then Essence of Flame, having the 30% increased initial damage on that will be impactful. It's just not, compared to the other things in Seething Truth, it's not the most impactful, but it is a good thing that will overall boost our damage, mainly our initial burst damage, when we use Essay of Fire to, say, start fights solo, and have slightly less effect on our sustained DPS rotation if we're in longer fights. But that finishes out the red line as far as the set bonuses go, and if we now we have more of an option, I guess, to dip into other lines, but I would actually recommend going ahead and finishing some things out in the red line, mainly Conflagration of Runes. And this is kind of the point when you can decide if you want to dip into other lines, maybe stay in the red line a little bit, get some defensive boost, or go into the blue line for maybe some other type of healing. And then the yellow line would be kind of more DPS output and a little bit of utility. So what I do with my Rune Keepers is I do a little bit more at the red line, because I think this is a good point, because you still, if you went into an other line, you would still have to spend 2 trait points in that to get whatever trait instead of 1 trait point in the red line. And we do have some useful things in the red line that would help us. So I think going into the red line at this point, going a little bit more into it, would be more beneficial. And I think this is the time. So we have 38 trait points. If you have been unlocking all your trait points and finish all your class deeds and have been unlocking all those, you'll be at some point in Moria around here. And I think at this point, it's really hard to say this because Scathing Mockery is so bad, but I think at this point you can go ahead and get that, because they'll start finding some more uses for it, especially if you do any sort of longer group content. But again, if you're never in an AoE situation, never doing longer fights, it's not worth putting a point in, unless you just like using it for its effect. If that's fun for you for LOTRO, you can do you and pick whatever is fun for you as far as that. It does have a neat animation with it. I think I mentioned that earlier, I meant to at least, but that would be one reason to put a point in it if you just want to see that. But I do think at this point we could go ahead and put a point in it, and then I would go basically the same order I talked about earlier for defensive boosts, and go ahead and boost our defenses up, make us a little bit more survivable. And that would be 46 points spent, so I actually do want to go back a little bit. And I think sometime around here is the maximum you have in Mines of Moria. It might be 42. I think I heard 42 from somebody. But anyway, the point is, around this time is when you'll be ending Mines of Moria as far as like the legendary servers go, with the maximum trait points you have. So this would be kind of what the build looks like at the end of Moria, and I think this is a pretty decent one. Of course, if you do have 43 trait points, it's great that you can finish this, but it would be really nice to finish Haste and Determination here, and I don't know, again, the exact number of trait points. I just heard 42. It could be something else, and yeah, that would be kind of where we go from here. We would go ahead and put the last point in that and then do the physical mitigation one again, boost our defensive some, and just make us a little bit more well-rounded and less glass cannon-y. So at this point, you kind of have to decide blue line versus yellow line, and for what I do on my Rune Keepers, I prefer yellow line. You can get a little bit of healing from the blue line, and the blue line, the main appeal from that would actually be getting the healing runestone and making Mending Verse a bit strong, but also just some raw will you could get from Determination here, and that's kind of what you dip into the blue line for. So just to preview what the build would look like in the blue line if I dipped into that, you would really want to get the increased Mending Verse pulse count and reduce the induction by 1 second. That's actually pretty significant. If you're a Rune Keeper healer, this is the first thing you want to get, but that's not what we're doing with this build. And then I'll get the runestone and then put some points in. We actually unlock this, but we don't want anything in that row. And then just put points to increase Mending Verse healing. I'd actually get one more point in will before that, but yeah, this is what, if I dipped into the blue line, what I would look at like, and the reason to go into the blue line, again, is to get some extra beneficial healing for your group, but generally that's not needed as much because you're better off like actively DPSing, but you do get a little bit extra utility with like the healing runestone and having the option to be able to have some heals and maybe self-heal a little bit quicker, especially as you get Prolonged Verse to make Mending Verse a lot stronger. But for my characters, I don't really ever feel like I need to actually go into the blue line and get any of that. I prefer going into the yellow line. So in the yellow line, we have Ceaseless Argument, which is actually a lightning skill. And you see I have a spot open here on my skill bar for Control 1, and that's actually where Ceaseless Argument goes because I think it is worth putting a point in. And the reason I think that is because sometimes you just need to kite and you can't really avoid it. You need to be running for some reason, and having something you can use while running is beneficial, and it has no cooldown is kind of the appeal to it. When you have Scribe Spark and Essence of Storm, you can use both of those while running, but they have cooldown. So if you need to kite and be running and attacking at the same time for some reason, going ahead and spending a trait point in that is worth it, especially if we compare what we have in this line. And the other thing I would recommend in the yellow line is actually crit defense, boost our defenses some, but you do have the option if you find yourself using Shocking Touch and want the increased daze duration. The increased damage from that is honestly not that much. It doesn't do much damage, and up to 25% increased damage is not really great, but if you find you want the increased daze duration, that's definitely an option. And then the main appeal of the yellow line is actually the tactical crit chance, which significantly boosts DPS by critting more. So that is definitely something appealing, and Fate is honestly a bad stat, so I won't put points in that, but this is one of the main appealing things in the yellow line for red line Rune Keepers. And I have one more trait point to spend, at least in another line. I have 2 points available technically, so I would go ahead and get the Lightning Runestone. That it does apply some utility by doing AoE stun. And now you can kind of see how my skill bar fills out with the stuff we got: Essay of Fire, Essence of Flame, Combustion, and then the Runestones, and then Scathing Mockery, and then Distracting Flame way down here, which I think you get that by leveling. But to get back to the traits, if I were to put some points in something else, I could just dip into the blue line and get the Runestone if I had more trait points, and that's kind of what would be most appealing. But if you wanted to get a little bit more in the yellow line, just be a little bit more hybridy, you could get Epic Conclusion, but that's not the most appealing. You have some other things that if you really need to use something like that, you have Shocking Words, which also stuns, but yeah, there's just not too much in the yellow line that's really worth getting. You could get one more point in crit defense, so this is when I would dip into the blue line. Actually, there's just not much here on the yellow line after you get the runestone and the crit chance, so that would be a good time to dip into the blue line, get some utility there. But we can go ahead and get into the gameplay section of this guide. So the good old gameplay sections of these guides, with being a level 120 character, not really having anything to do on landscape that I could actually show basically anything for this, but I decided to go ahead and do the 3-man school at Theomeridane here, just set to level 120 tier 1. It is a 3-man, so it is a little bit tougher solo, but I think I should be able to show some more of the gameplay elements with Fire Rune Keeper here. I will also actually switch to Turtle Villicle at the end here, which is a level 58 raid. But the reason I will be doing that is so I can show a little bit more of the actual rotation with a longer fight when I don't really have to worry about like dying or doing all the solo stuff where you might have to, in a longer fight like that, do some more utility type things and just do some other things. So I think that will be good. And I actually feel like I should go ahead and get into this. So we'll go ahead and just start killing things. But I feel like this guide has been really long so far, and it might just be because I'm passionate about Rune Keeper. But to go over what I'm doing here, I did Essay of Fire, then Essence of Flame as my opener, Volcanic Runestone, that same combination I mentioned earlier. And then even on a signature with, again, my gear level, the specific situation, that was enough to kill the first mob. And it looks like I need to use my Lightning Runestone here, and I pulled 2 archers here, and they just do so much damage to me. I'm probably going to die, but we can actually show some utility of switching, if I were able to get it off in time, switching to steady hands, because that just completely changes your attunement to the other side, to the healing attunement from battle basically at that point, and using Word of Exhaustion would bubble me. So that's kind of a little utility benefit you could get as Rune Keeper to quickly switch. Okay, so my armor broke, so I had to quickly dip out and repair, but I hope this will be able to show just some of the ways I use skills. I will try to talk through everything. We actually have a fight here. A little bit tougher fights than I remember in this instance, but this might actually be a time. Oh, these are the ones running. So I only pulled a couple of these, and I'm doing the same opener again. This is the same thing I would do on Landscape, is I would open Essay of Fire, Essence of Flame, and then do my Fire Runestone. Now I have some extra mobs to clear up, and you see the Fire Runestone's actually tanking these mobs, so even at level 120, while it doesn't do as nice damage, it's still good as far as that goes. And you probably noticed I haven't actually used Combustion yet because I haven't really gotten great of a chance to, but even in these smaller AoE fights I'm not. And I'm also not using Scathing Mockery, just opening Essay of Fire, get the burst damage with Essence of Flame, and the AoE benefit with that, and then kind of the rotation would go Fire Ridicule and Rid of Fire, kind of alternating those in the downtime, and using Essay of Fire on cooldown and Smoldering Wrath on cooldown. But we can go ahead and do another fight here. And I think I have another archer on me, so another great time to use the Runestone. When you're only fighting a ranged mob, I do want to mention that the Runestone might not be the best. Okay, so I actually disconnected there, and I think LOTRO just doesn't want me to have a smooth episode for this guide, but to go a little bit over the combat that I was doing there, just to recap a little bit, always open Essay of Fire, then Essence of Flame, and then you can build 3 attunement quickly. In some fights it would be more useful to go ahead and get Fire Ridicule and Rid of Fire building up if you don't mind building your attunement slightly slower for more sustained damage, but in a lot of burst fights and quicker fights, using the Runestone is a better option. You also have Essence of Storm if you like get 0 benefit at all out of the Runestone but still want to quickly build attunement, just to have Smoldering Wrath go off and basically kill the enemy. But that would kind of be your opener, and then you have Fire Ridicule and Rid of Fire as more of your sustained things to fill. You kind of want to alternate them, keep their dots up and get them up to tier 3 eventually, and make sure you kind of keep that up. And then just waiting for Essay of Fire and using that in combination with Essay of Flame, and then going back to Smoldering Wrath. And sometimes within your rotation you can kind of work in a Combustion, and the main thing you want to use Combustion in a single target situation is just when you know you can build your attunement quickly back up to Smoldering Wrath, if Smoldering Wrath is on cooldown, to use it on cooldown. So it looks like once we run in here, it'll actually trigger. So the turtle was recently buffed with his morale, so we should be able to do some more testing than it used to be. So I actually placed the Runestone. I did not mean to do that, it's just kind of force of habit at this point. But in a longer fight like this, I would open up doing, here's actually a time I can quickly get in Combustion in combination with Essay of Fire actually. Now I can just raw cast Essence of Flame and then Rid of Fire there, then quickly build the attunement with Essence of Storm to actually go back to Smoldering Wrath. And I shouldn't need to worry about taking too much damage because this fight, even though it is lasting a little bit longer here, we're actually kind of falling into that rotation. I don't really like that because Essence of Flame isn't the most appealing thing to use without Essay of Fire. So we'll go ahead and just let that go off and then use Smoldering Wrath here and get back on track with Essay of Fire and Essence of Flame. Essence of Flame, as I mentioned, isn't the most appealing to use when you don't have anything else, and I think this is a good time to use the Runestone, quickly build some attunement, and same thing with that, then we can get a Fire Ridicule and then go ahead and use Smoldering Wrath again. And I feel like this is a lot more effective in actually showing the Fire Rune Keeper rotation a little bit more in its practical use. And in a longer fight like this, I'm still not using Scathing Mockery because it's just so unappealing, but if you're, I did not mean to use Smoldering Wrath there, but sometimes you have Essay of Fire where you don't have Essence of Flame, and when you have all your dots completely checked up on and everything's tier 3, If you still have quite a bit longer in your fight, actually don't want to use Combustion here because Smoldering Wrath is almost off cooldown. That is when you could consider using Scathing Mockery in a solo situation, defeating a single mob. So let's go ahead and loot this, but I hope the gameplay section here was helpful even with all the issues, me disconnecting and lagging and all that sort of stuff. And I hope this guide was overall useful. Again, I feel like this was super long, but it could just be because I'm passionate about the Rune Keeper and like it a lot and wanted to talk a lot about it, but I hope with that at least in mind it was still helpful. I don't know, it's kind of, I was looking at feedback as far as the length of these, and I think some of my recent ones have been a little bit shorter again, and a lot of them have been really long, and to me kind of when it gets above 40 minutes that's like really long. But if anyone has feedback regarding the length, if I should like cover stuff quicker or even take more time on things and do these a little bit longer, just do let me know. I would really appreciate that, because a lot of these, again, when they get over 40 minutes, like I don't know exactly how long this one's been going, but I feel like it's been over that. It just feels a little bit too long to me. But as far as like what I go over this, I think that's kind of just naturally the way it goes because I go over a lot of in-depth explanation. So I just kind of want to share some of my thoughts on the length of these because it is kind of something that bothers me a lot at the end here. But to get to actually doing the outro here, again, I hope you all did enjoy this one and learn something useful. But if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more. And thanks for watching, everyone.